Today's webinar, Debates on Holocaust Memory, Coloniality, Black Lives, and Multidirectionality, is sponsored by the University of Michigan and the University of Oklahoma, both member institutions of the German Studies Association. As GSA president, it gives me great pleasure to launch this first in a series of association webinars. If you'd like to host or co-host a future GSA webinar like this one, in consultation with the GSA leadership, you can encourage your university to seek institutional level membership in our organization. You can find the webpage for GSA institutional membership in the Q&A of this webinar, or you can simply visit our website, which is www.thegsa.org, for more details. My name's Janet Ward, and I'm really, truly honored to now introduce Damani Partridge, host and moderator of today's webinar. Dr. Partridge will introduce our two speakers, but first I'd like to say a few words to introduce him. Damani Partridge is Professor of Anthropology and Afro-American and African Studies, as well as Director of Social Justice Initiatives at the University of Michigan. He is the director of filmingfuturecities.org on Berlin and Detroit, and he is the author of Hypersexuality and Headscarves, Race, Sex, and Citizenship in the New Germany, which appeared with Indiana University Press in 2012. His new book, Blackness as a Universal Claim, Holocaust Heritage, Non-Citizen Futures, and Black Power in Berlin, is forthcoming in 2022 with the University of California Press. Damani currently serves the German Studies Association as a member of our Committee for Institutional Transformation and Social Justice. Welcome, Damani, Michael, and Esra, and over to you now, Damani.
Thank you, Janet, so much for that introduction, and thank you, Michael and Esra, for joining us. It's so great to have you both here. Again, the title of the discussion is Holocaust Memory, Coloniality, Black Lives, and Multidirectionality. Obviously, you'll see some ideas about what's forthcoming, but let me introduce the speakers, the discussants first. Michael Rothberg is a 1939 Society of Sammelgert's Chair in Holocaust Studies, Professor of English and Comparative Literature, and Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His latest book, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, it was published by Stanford University Press in 2019. And his previous book, which was recently translated into German, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, was published originally in English in 2009. And his book, Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation, was published in 2000. And he's quoted a number of other books, including with Yasmin Yıldız, Memory, Citizenship, Migrant, Archives of Holocaust Remembrance, which is with Fordham University Press. Esra Özyürek is the Sultan Qaboos Professor in Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge in England, and an anthropologist of religion and politics in the Middle East and Europe. She is the author of Being German, Becoming Muslim, Race, Religion, and Conversation in New Europe, published by Princeton University Press in 2014, and Nostalgia for the Modern, State Secularism and Everyday Politics in Turkey, published by Duke in 2009, and her book manuscript, Shouldering the Guilt, Embracing Empathy, Holocaust Memory and Muslim Belonging in Postwar Germany, is under review for Stanford University Press and will be forthcoming. So thank you both for joining us. I guess really what we're trying to think about here, and what I would like to know from you was, I mean, why do you think things are so heated in the debates about memory now? Clearly, Holocaust memory is an ongoing dynamic. In Germany in particular, it seems that what has been called the Historikerstreit II has really positioned people as sometimes no longer employable, sometimes no longer able to participate in the public discussion because of their positions in relationship with the Holocaust. But can you talk about your understanding of why this debate is occurring now? Michael, can you help us with that?
Sure. Yeah, first, let me just say thank you to Janet Ward and to the GSA for hosting this, and Damani for the original invitation and the nice introduction. It's really great to be here with Esra and Damani. We've actually known each other for many years. We have a lot of shared interests, and have had many discussions over the past, 10 to 15 years about the relationship between, let's say, race, migration, religion, and Holocaust memory in Germany. And it would have been easy to imagine any time in that last decade or so, a decade and a half, us coming together on a panel like this, but somehow I don't think it's ever happened. I don't think the three of us have ever appeared together on a panel before. So it would have been easy to imagine that, but it would have been difficult for me to imagine that we'd be doing it under the circumstances that we are. And by that, I don't actually mean Zoom and the pandemic, but really this very heated debate about the Holocaust that's been going on, especially for the last year and a half. And at least for me personally, I have a feeling that, something has shifted. One of the things that shifted personally is, I've gone from being an observer of German memory debates, a scholar of German memory, but also all of a sudden becoming kind of involved in them as a participant and kind of implicated in those debates. And that's a new thing. Certainly for me. And I think there's something interesting that we'll want to try to explore today, a kind of tension between these longer term trends, which are, I think, reflected in the longer term interest that the three of us have and that many other people have as well. And then the real strong sense that something new has happened or something has changed. And so I think the explanation for that question, Damani, has to do both, with somehow coordinating or putting together longer term and shorter term phenomena, I suppose. The situation is not new, and I think especially for people in Germany, they've been experiencing and really suffering under the phenomena that we're going to be talking about here today for quite a long time. And what that situation is, I think, will emerge as we go along, though I think a lot of people are already familiar with it. At the same time, I think we are inside what I would call a new cycle of debates, which are characterized, I think, partly by their international quality. I think that's one of the things that's new about the last year and a half. And the question of the origins are, again, I think are interesting to explore, and we will. The debates, I know a lot of people here have looked at the list, and a lot of people are quite well versed in what's going on, but I imagine there's some people who are not. So before even getting to the question of the why now, I think it might be important to say, what is going on exactly? The debates that we're talking about concern, I think, a number of different issues, but really, I think at the heart of it is a perennial debate about the uniqueness and comparability of the Holocaust, right? And today, what that means is especially the comparison of the Holocaust to colonial violence, colonial genocide and colonial violence more broadly. But those questions of comparability, including the comparison with colonialism, are linked in turn to a whole other series of issues, such as the definition of anti-Semitism and the relationship of anti-Semitism to what I would call other forms of racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim racism, et cetera. And then the relationship of all of that to what are acceptable and unacceptable critiques of the state of Israel. Right. So I think those are some of the hottest issues at stake. For me, as a participant, this cycle of debates began in 2020 in the spring with the projected or the demanded disinvitation of Achille Mbembe from the Ruhr Triennial Cultural Festival. Right, where this incredibly important Cameroonian, South African-based historian and theorist was accused, I thought, quite unfairly, of Holocaust relativization and anti-Semitism because of some cherry-picked quotations from his really vast writings that people in Germany objected to. And that went on for some months, and I myself participated in a small way in that debate. And then the debate picked up again at the beginning of this year when my book, Multidirectional Memory, was translated into German 12 years after it was originally published. I wouldn't say it was particularly controversial in most other contexts. It's been pretty positively received. Of course, there are criticisms that have been made and one could and should make, but I wouldn't say it ever was controversial until it appeared in Germany. And in the critique of the book, which was very public and I would say very hostile, and I think that hostility and aggressiveness is one of the qualities of the German debates that we might want to discuss. Not only was my work being put into question, I think frequently misunderstood, it seemed to me, distorted in different ways, but it was interesting that a lot of these early reviews also, and it continues, used my book as an opportunity also to criticize Jürgen Simmerer and his work on the relationship between the genocide in Southwest Africa and the Holocaust. And so Jürgen and I wrote a piece in response to those rather nasty reviews that was published in Die Zeit, and that set off another round of discussions. And then our colleague and friend Dirk Moses took this in some sense to another level with a very sharply worded and polemical piece called the German Catechism, which set off in turn a third, kind of round in this cycle of debates. And what Dirk focused on especially was really questions about free speech in relationship to Israel-Palestine. And since he published that, there's been a lot of evidence in fact, I think to support aspects of his argument. And I'm sure we'll return to that. I would just say, I think the culmination of this cycle, or this phase of the cycle at least, happened for me at least in September, when Jürgen Habermas weighed in for the first time on these debates in a way that was, I thought, impressively measured and reasonable, and not at all, I think, what some people expected. And we can come back to the details of that, I suppose. But one of the things that he said that I thought was really important is he said, of course, we in Germany recognize the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and we must. It's part of our responsibility as Germans, but memory culture cannot let itself freeze over, right? It has to be dynamic. And the attention to colonial histories is an important, wichtige Erweiterung, he said, right? An important expansion of the memory culture in Germany. And that was then picked up at the opening of the ethnological museums of the Humboldt Forum by the president, Steinmeier, who also said, well, of course, as Bundespresident, I have to acknowledge the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but this turn toward colonial memory is also something important. So at least rhetorically, something important happened there, I think, in that last sequence with Habermas and Steinmeier. So we're no longer in the most heated moments, is my impression of this debate, though you never know when it's going to pick up again. But new pieces continue to appear weekly, if not more frequently, and there's a kind of reflexivity as well to these debates, in which we enter quickly into meta debates about the debates. And this is an example of that, I suppose, right? This panel is part of that meta debate. And my impression is that in Germany, this is also happening. And I know of various panels, workshops, and conferences that are planned in the coming weeks that are taking up exactly these sorts of issues and continuing the discussion. So I think it's going to go on in some form or other, even if we're maybe in a bit of a lull at the moment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I might ask you to come back to this question of hostility and why the debate is so hostile. But Esra, can you talk about? Do you agree with the what, or do you think that would you position differently, and if so, how?
Yeah. First, thank you so much again inviting me. It is, as Michael said, we have been, three of us and more people have been looking at the Holocaust memory, but my feeling was that we have been looking at it from its margins, right? I have been looking at from Muslim perspective. Damani has been looking at Muslims, also, Vietnamese and African immigrants. Michael has been looking at it from the colonies, and suddenly what used to be the margins became the center of the discussion, and what we have been saying also suddenly being so explosive. So that really is surprising to me, but I guess we have been observing something that was starting beginning of 2000s, and then as the discourse moved, as if the periphery has collapsed into the center, and the whole thing imploded in a way. So obviously, Michael's depiction is very correct. I just want to attract attention to, I think, multiple things are happening at the same moment. So I want to talk a little bit about the sister discourse, anti-Semitism accusations. Obviously, Holocaust memory and talking about anti-Semitism are intricately connected to each other, but they are not one and the same thing. They are, I think, two discourses, that crisscross. So what we have been observing in the last few years also have been, another development. I can talk about the history of it in the coming minutes. So we have been observing this exponential increase of anti-Semitism accusation. It has been being discussed in the kitchen tables of Muslim intellectuals, definitely in Muslim youth clubs a lot. But what happened in the last few years is that the same kinds of accusations of accusing people of being anti-Semites in a way that shocks people and being directed to people who have dedicated their entire lives to fight against anti-Semitism, anti-racism, that they, to their core, they define themselves anti-fascist, that is why they live, that those people have been accused of being anti-Semites. And that has been a shocking reality. So people who have not been accused in, liberal Jewish intellectuals, white liberals, right? The people who have been, both protected or it was unthinkable. So I think that is definitely new. That it happened with Mbembe is also new, but I think what is new is this accusation moving towards Jewish people and white liberals in Germany who also have been occupying, maybe occupying is the wrong word, but leading, let's say, cultural institutions that have been defining and moving forward post-war German identity, which is defining itself against, the Third Reich, having learned the lessons from it, creating the cultural spaces in which such political education is possible, have suddenly found themselves of being accused or living under the threat of being accused about it. So I think that, and also that created a sense of division between, white liberals might be wrong, but let's say white center to the left, little bit to the right, let's say center, white Germans. The kind of unity that has been observed in the center in defining themselves against anti-Semitism has been difficult. And in a lot of, as Michael was saying, there are many, many such conferences and workshops that are being organized. In preparation panels, some of the things I hear are like this: oh, now there's a division. How can we come over this division? How can we bring ourselves together? So when this came to the center, it is being observed as a division, but it has been going on for a long time. So I feel like this is what is new. I don't know, Damani, if you observe something that is new.
Maybe we can come back to me and ask you more questions. And then I think eventually, I think in the questions, I think some of the answers are probably embedded. But I think this question of hostility that Michael was raising to me raises a question about stakes. Like, what are the stakes of having this debate? Why is it so intense now? And then I think the questions, and I would ask you, Esra, after Michael sort of thinks about that. To add about, is it a question of who gets to participate not only in the debate, but who gets to participate in the democracy? And then is it really just a national debate, even though it's being framed that way, or is it actually a transnational debate that's being managed and organized, orchestrated by Germany to some extent, by people based in Germany or people engaged with Germany? Some of the scholars are based in the US, obviously, but who gets to participate? But first, I think this question about hostility, why the hostility? What are the stakes of having this debate again now? Michael.
Do you want me to take that, or Esra, did you want to weigh in on that first?
If you can, again, if I continue with the issue of anti-Semitism, obviously that is a huge international discussion that is taking place. Also, so much has been around the issue of International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, and who accepts it, who doesn't, and how it is being used to mark and penalize people as anti-Semitic. For example, in the German context, if you are, IRA definition has, multiple examples about what is anti-Semitic, what is not anti-Semitic, and obviously the tension is about how to criticize Israel or not. The discussions have been focused around that, and it's many observers concur that it came to such an extent that your old reliable anti-Semitism that is promoted by right wing, and that is also the people who have been committing, according to German police records, 90% of the anti-Semitic crimes go under the radar. But when it comes to critique of Israel, then let's say bells start to ring. And this is the case in Germany. In the UK, the Tory government has asked universities to accept IRA definition, while at the same time they have asked to accept, I don't know, I can't remember the right word now, but freedom of expression has been really important. But in both cases, they both feel or are a very Tory government project. So it's who then gets excluded, who gets silenced, who, let's say, is asked to leave the panel, even, let's say, to moderate it, to someone else, are minorities, Muslim, Arab background people, or people who ally with them, or who criticize Israel. But in the UK, there are also, because they never came to terms with anti-Semitism in the way Germany has, there is a lot of anti-Semitism that, to this day surprises me when I encounter it. So those kinds of more traditional right-wing anti-Semitism doesn't get the kind of reaction that critique of Israel gets. And that definitely is a, international transformation that has been making the fight against anti-Semitism, maybe for the first time, at least in my lifetime, more a right-wing project than, when I was growing up, it was clearly a left-wing project. In Turkey, those of us who defined ourselves as anti-Semites were the hardcore leftists. So in my lifetime, it became something that more right-wing governments develop, and they are connected to each other.
I mean, I would agree with what Esra was just saying. I would say I think fighting anti-Semitism obviously has to remain a left-wing project too, but it's become more difficult because of the way that discourse has been appropriated by the right and the way it's being weaponized and instrumentalized. So part of our job becomes to be able to make those kinds of distinctions between when we're really fighting anti-Semitism and when, in fact, what's at stake is really criticism of Israel. And I think that is, I talked at the beginning, or mentioned at the beginning, that I thought there were both shorter and longer term factors involved in this question of why now. And I think that also, the why now is also a question about why so aggressive, right? Why so affectively charged, right? And I'm sure there are other explanations for this too. But I do think that one of the short-term causes in the German context is certainly, and this is maybe as much an effect as a cause, but it's still very important, right? The 2019 Bundestag anti-BDS resolution, which basically, even though it doesn't quite have legal standing, it has a very chilling effect, as we all know, and we can name various examples of that. And so I think that the fact that Germany sees the defense of Israel as Staatsräson, right, as so fundamental to the definition of the state, and that that has taken a kind of turn, I think, with a lot of campaigning also on the part of Israel itself under Netanyahu, but I don't doubt that that will continue as well, to disqualify criticism of Israeli policy by using the anti-Semitism charge, which is a very, it's a strong charge, and it's a charge that we should respond to, that we need to respond to, and especially in Germany, of course, even more sensitivity, as there should be, right? But within that context, then it becomes ever more important to be clear about what we're talking about. So I do think that whole question of Israel and the way that has been playing out in the last few years is a very large part of, in terms of the shorter term causes of what's been going on. Another thing, and this is something that Susan Neiman has been saying, I've heard her say it now a couple of times at conferences and talks, what she describes as a kind of, this is her word, hysterical response to the victory or the electoral success of the AfD starting in 2017, right? So that the very visible rise of the far right, electorally especially, has caused a kind of panicked response and maybe over response on the part of liberals and the center, if you will. And I do think that's also a factor as well. But I do think there are also, obviously longer term factors that we'd have to take into account. Sebastian Conrad, the German historian, made, I think, an interesting argument about trying to pose this very question, right? Why is this all happening now? And he talks about a really kind of large scale shift from what he calls memory one to memory two. And by memory one, he's talking about a kind of Cold War era memory, not strictly nation-based, but in the German context, Western oriented, right? And part of a kind of Cold War discourse. And that there was the sort of rise of Holocaust memory took place in that very Western oriented context. And as you move into the 21st century, he sees, as I think we all do, a kind of globalization of memory that takes place, including, of course, a globalization of Holocaust memory. And so you've got a whole new sort of framework, a new regime of memory that emerges in the 21st century. And he sees then this shift from memory one to memory two, the globalization, as setting the stage for some of these new kinds of conflicts. And I definitely think there's something to that. But I guess I also think that part of the issue is continuities that remain across that divide between, again, the first form of memory regime and the second form of memory regime. And that, in fact, part of what's playing out here is tensions precisely between continuities around a sense of what German identity is, a very white Christian sense of German identity, and the obviously more heterogeneous society, right, that you find in Germany, and of course was always there to some extent, but has become more visible, and in some ways probably has intensified with various new forms of globalization, migration, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this kind of there's a tension between continuity and rupture that is very important, and this was central to what Yasmin Yildiz and I have been exploring for many years now in our unfinished book that we're calling at the moment Memory Citizenship. And what we diagnosed like a decade ago, and other people were talking in similar terms, as the German paradox, right? The notion that taking responsibility for and remembering the Holocaust required reproducing a certain racialized notion of German identity that was in fact behind the Holocaust in the first place, right? So to be German means to take responsibility for the Holocaust, and to take responsibility for the Holocaust means is to trace a kind of, almost family inheritance of the Holocaust, which reproduces an ethnified or racialized version of German identity all over again in the name of Holocaust memory. And that produces for others what we call the migrant double bind, which is that on the one hand, to be German, you have to remember the Holocaust. But if you're not already German, you can't remember the Holocaust. It's not your history, right? And so I think that tension is still very much around, even though there have been various shifts in recent years as well. And people are being simultaneously told, you must do this, right? But you can't do it at the same time. And I think actually you see that, and I know, Esra, you want to probably talk more about this too, but the case of Naimi Hassan, right? It seems like no matter what she does, she can never be the person who will have the right response to anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that double bind, I think, playing out quite strongly to this day. And finally, I think last factor I would mention, and this is sort of at the intersection of longer and shorter term trends, I think that the confrontation with colonialism, both in Germany and more broadly in Europe and elsewhere, it's been going on for a long time, right? Activists have been working on this, restitution demands have been made for decades, but somehow we've hit a kind of tipping point, right, recently. And it's, you know, which is not to say that everything's going to be okay now, but it does feel like a dam has broken. And it's no longer possible to ignore these kinds of decolonial, anti-colonial movements and the demands that are being made about restitution, street renaming, reparations, et cetera, et cetera. Where it will all go, we don't know, but there's been a qualitative change there. And I think that's playing into the larger dynamic as well.
Thank you. I mean, you both raised a number of important points here. I think it seems that, we keep coming back to Germany. I'm just wondering, but then you're also talking about that you're talking what you're calling memory too, Michael. There's been an expansion on globalization, but it seems to be expanding from Germany in part, like these anti-BDS laws, are now in the US as well. And I don't think
but I don't think they're coming from Germany. I wouldn't say Germany is the origin of them. I think it is but I think you're right. It's a transnational discourse, and there are both clear similarities in various national contexts, but also specificities like Esra was explaining. I do think the British context is different from the American one. Both are different from Germany. They're all different from France. And so you see both, common dynamics and structures, and then they do play out also on the ground, I think, in significantly different ways, but they're circulating for sure.
I think two things are also happening about why now, or what is happening now. We keep returning to that question. I think two things. More and more research concurs that white Germans, let's say, feel they had enough. With this Holocaust memory culture, they want to move on. They want to be a normal nation. But at the same time, they do not want to give up the ownership of being the home to the biggest guilt, the biggest lesson, a lesson that will give, a great moral lesson to the rest of the world. So maybe this is a parallel paradox that Michael is telling. So in this new book, hopefully will come out. I'm debating if I should call it subcontracting the guilt or shouldering the guilt. But I feel like what is happening is that the guilt is subcontracted to immigrants, so that it will be there. The work will be kept going. The, immigrants or refugees will keep going to the camps so that there is a constant flow at the camps. And that, there will be lots of, millions and millions of euros will be spent. Education programs will be done. But the subject of it will be the immigrants, so it will be a moralizing, colonizing, enlightenment project. In my research, I'm finding out that there are some people who are willing to take over the subcontracting job on the basis of being accepted, on the basis of then saying, okay, then give us a new social contract where we are also included in being German. We'll take this thing that you don't want so much, but you still want to spend money and effort. So we'll take it on our shoulders. So that is happening. So in a way, what is happening is how Germany is trying to deal with and is having difficulty dealing with its increased diversification, right? Now, 1 in every 4 person is not German background. So how are they going to deal with that? So a part is that. And I think another really important part is what is going to happen to Europe or to the US or the transatlantic or, the white Christian civilization that, we know, okay, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 30 years, they are not going to be able to compete with China. They're not going to be, where the power, the money, everything is. And they And also on top of it, what will happen if we think smaller, what will happen to the European Union that the Germany invested so much on? Okay, it benefited also financially, but it also carried it as well. So maybe the European Union will fall apart. So then what will happen? Then maybe their founding event will not be so important. Maybe it will be one of the many, many bad things that humans have done to each other. So I feel like it is both anxiety internal to Germany, but it is also anxiety about what will happen to Europe.
Is it really anxiety, or is it a claim to kind of moral superiority? I mean, so that which seems to be replicated in those other contexts we were talking about, like in the UK and the US, but then also limits who can participate, right? If certain subjects are always already anti-Semitic, then they can never really participate in the democracy, because then they've already lost any kind of moral claim to participating in liberalism. But is that also then a liberal trap? I mean, like that one, the liberalism itself, as in this case, I mean, I would argue that it is being led by Germany. Maybe we can discuss that, but or that, I mean, if we trace historically, like where just the anti-BDS as an example, like how that's moved around the world, where that's moved and when it started, where and where it's moved, where. That creates, it allows one to have those distinctions between claims about a kind of universal possibility of participation versus a reality where certain people can't participate at all. I mean, Mbembe, I think, is an interesting case, which you've written about, Esra, in the sense that he's not located in Germany. I mean, Michael said that. I mean, he's located in South Africa, lived in the US, but is from Cameroon. But then somehow he's drawn into this debate, kind of without really participating in it directly. It's kind of an indirect participation. He's drawn it, so it seems, so then it does kind of, but it's because he was going to be awarded a prize in Germany. So it means there is a way in which the kind of regulation, even though it's claiming to be like bound within the nation state, actually has these kind of, even the regulation has a kind of global implication in terms of who and how people can participate, which then allows, I mean, in terms of thinking about the Europe, I mean, as you were talking about, Esra, the future of Europe allows, at least, even if not economically, it allows kind of a moral sustenance, to claim a kind of a central position in sort of geopolitics. In terms of your thinking about we've talked about subcontracting a little bit before. I mean, to some people that's a bit controversial, but does it tie also to the funding for these initiatives? I mean, so I think maybe you should talk a little bit about that so that people get a sense of.
Yeah. Definitely. When I worked with Muslim background immigrants who work in the field of fighting against anti-Semitism, I would say their primary motivation is to fight against anti-Semitism and also finding a way to think about and talk about racism in Germany. I would say that is their primary motivation. But at the same time, this really is a huge field. It is quite difficult, if you're a smart, immigrant background, young person, coming from working class parents. There are so many glass ceilings that research talks about. It takes you have to apply to 6 times or maybe 15 times to more jobs, and there's limitations in the housing market, whatnot. So it is quite difficult to go forward. But now there is this field of Muslims educating Muslims about anti-Semitism, and the money that has been devoted to it. For the, as far as I could trace, in 2006, the Ministry of Education, Youth, Families started by 20 million, but now it is in hundreds and hundreds of millions of euros are being, centrally and also outside centrally, money is being dedicated. And there is almost no such money you can apply if you say, I want to fight against racism. So that money part also gave me this idea of subcontracting. And so much of that is directed against anti-Semitism among Muslims. Again, when 90% of anti-Semitic crimes are committed by right-wing, white, Christian background Germans.
Thank you. I could tell, Michael, you wanted to say something. I mean, there's this question, about, maybe I was wrong. It seems like there's this question of implication, but then there's also a question of participation. What's the relationship between implication and potential participation? I guess that's the question I've been asking.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Yeah, no, I've just been listening to Esra and finding what she's saying fascinating. And there are lots of different dimensions to these topics that one could go in a lot of different directions. But since you mentioned implication, that is something I've been thinking about. It seems to me that what is needed, perhaps in German memory cultures, and I always find it important to say when I talk about this, it's like I don't talk critically of German memory culture in any kind of self-righteous way. I'm an American, right? Like we have no critical culture, practically no critical culture of memory, and very significant crimes that we need to grapple with, and we have started to slowly, right? But so this is none of this comes from a place of self-righteousness, but rather from a place of feeling implicated, in fact, in the American context, and also more broadly in the Israel-Palestine question as well, as a Jewish person. So Susan Neiman, when she talks about this stuff, I've referred to her already, but I do think she's written some important. Well, her book on this question is quite important, especially in the comparative context. And so she traces this shift in memory. What she sees as the great German accomplishment is a shift from, as she calls it, right, first you have a kind of heroic national memory, and if that doesn't work because you've just committed, one of the most horrific genocides of all time, then you can't occupy the position of hero anymore. So then you sort of recreate yourself as victims. We too were victims of the war, et cetera, et cetera. And what she sees then as the accomplishment is the shift from that to an embrace of the perpetrator position, right? So that, which takes place, I think, slowly over decades, starts to pick up speed, I would say, really in the 80s, and then really in the post-unification period becomes kind of nationalized as an official memory culture. And it has to do, again, precisely with taking responsibility for an act of perpetration and for a perpetrator culture. But it seems to me, and I think this is where it starts to get complicated in a multicultural society, as you guys know very well and have written about as well. What happens when everybody in the society, or really 25% or 20% or whatever the current numbers are, don't actually share that same link back to that at least in a familial sense, to that history of perpetration. I don't think one has to have a familial link in order to be connected to it. That's not at all what I'm saying, though sometimes it's understood that way. But it complicates the question. People are situated in different ways, right, in relationship to this dominant discourse of taking responsibility for perpetration. And I guess it seems to me, and I can't say I've thought this all the way out or all the way through, but that what might be useful would be a shift out of this victim-perpetrator binary toward a more complicated vision. And for me, at least, that means thinking about what I call implicated subjects, right? Those who have enabled violence, or who have benefited from violence, who have inherited in some way or other by virtue of national identity, or sometimes more intimate familial connection, but are not themselves perpetrators. And it seems to me it's a way of maybe opening up the discourse and seeing how many of us are in fact quite complexly situated, both in relationship to the Holocaust, but in relationship to these other histories that are at stake in the discussions that we've been contemplating here. So histories of colonialism, right? Israel-Palestine, contemporary forms of right-wing violence. And so all I'm trying to suggest is that maybe an important step in rethinking this memory culture would be to try to think more about, in more nuanced and complex ways, about how we're implicated in cross-cutting forms of violence, both historically and in terms of the contemporary world that we all occupy. I could say more about that, but I'll stop there for now and see if that made any sense.
Yeah, I think it did make sense. It reminds me that as we start to move towards questions, which we will shortly, you can ask questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. And Dirk Moses wants us to know these here, so I wanted you all to know that. But I was wondering, I mean, you gave this timeline from Susan Niemann to the embrace of the perpetrator. Are we now in a post-perpetrator discourse, at least as far as Germany is concerned? I mean, I know in your work, Esra, you talk a lot about Germany as teacher. I mean, so is that something beyond Germany as perpetrator, which is maybe a more dangerous position? And also then it avoids to some extent, if implication is, I mean, we've taken care of that, or that's kind of in the past, or it's kind of always, well, okay. I see Michael disagreeing, but I mean, you can answer that too. But I mean, is implication, at least as far as the official discourse is concerned, is that something that doesn't have to be proven anymore because we're now teachers? You know, at least that's a question I would ask. I mean, and we meaning like normative white Germans, not me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is very complicated, right? You know, like in a way, you know, on the one hand, you know, Michael spoke as an American. You know, in my lifetime, I accumulated 3 citizenships. Each is worse than the other in the way it deals with its past, you know, Turkish, American, the British, you know. I think, I don't know, maybe I should go to Myanmar or something next. You know, none of them is compared to Germany, right? None of them is dealing with its past, so far away. Yet at the same time, looking deeper into the German example, we also see that coming to terms with the past doesn't necessarily liberate you from racism, right? That is what annoys us, right? That is why, you know, I have been asked so many times, oh, you're a non-German, why do you deal with the Germans, deal with their past? You know, go look at your worst country, you know. But I feel like Holocaust memory belongs to all of us. I mean, I think it is too important, too big to be left to Germans. You know, I'm sorry, I will not leave it to Germans. I think, you know, we all will have so much to learn from it. What I was going to say. So what is happening is that, you know, I was at a talk, you know, Dervish Hizarcı from Berlin was giving a talk at Cambridge, and one of the audience members, a Jewish scholar from the Netherlands, was talking about how Holocaust is becoming separated from its Jewish victims, in the sense that Jews are not reproducing themselves in Europe, and they're just being turned into these museum objects. You know, so what will happen to the Holocaust memory when there are no Jews in Europe anymore? And then I brought it up. It is also being separated from its perpetrators too, as more and more Holocaust education programs are directed against immigrants. You know, so in a way, we want it to be more complicated, but the way it is being complicated, it looks like both the victim and the perpetrator is falling out. It just becomes a way to educate and enlighten the rest of the world, and to show them how to walk on the steps of Germany and become more democratic, right? That is also definitely the wrong way. Yeah, and then, you know, how can there be a better way is the question that we are all struggling.
Yeah, that's a big question.
To get to.
I mean, I just wanted. I think that's fascinating and important. I wanted to go back to this question of implication. I mean, that implicated subject hasn't been translated into German yet, so maybe you know, if there were the same kind of discussion as there is about now happening, or that it recently happened around multidirectionality and memory, there might be a different outcome, you know, if it was taken just as seriously. But I mean, you seem to be reacting strongly against the idea that we're in a post-perpetrator moment, Michael.
No, not exactly. How to say this? I mean, I have often had the feeling that in some of these debates about multidirectional memory, like, why don't you just read my next book? You will see that I'm not saying what you think I'm saying. I mean, one of these early reviews, I think it was the one in the FAZ, the last line was something like, we will not let Rothberg take away our German responsibility. Like, that's literally what this person said. And that's your response to multidirectional memory. Like, I don't know where that came from precisely, but it's certainly not my argument, right? And I think if you read Implicated Subject, though I don't think that would have been necessary, you would see that this is far from my project. And I think this is one of the things, I mean, I'm quite fascinated with, and maybe this will help address some of these different questions. I'm quite fascinated with the contrast between what's been happening in the last couple of years and the Historikerstreit of the 80s, right? And so, there's people have used the phrase, I've probably used it myself, Historikerstreit 2.0. There are reasons to be critical of that. I'm not sure that it is the best. Name. There are lots of other debates that have taken place. All of that stuff is true. But I think it's interesting as a point of contrast, right? And because what you see is, on the one hand, what is common to that moment in the 80s and the moment today is that what's at the center of the debate is this question of the comparability and uniqueness of the Holocaust. But almost everything else has changed, right? What's being compared is different. Back then, it was really about Stalinism and Nazism. Today, it really is primarily about colonialism, though there are all these other important issues alongside that as well. The players have changed to a certain extent. Maybe this starts to get at that question of perpetration versus implication. All of the people who took part, pretty much all of the people who took part in the Historikerstreit in the 80s were white German men who'd been born in the 20s. So in other words, had a formative experience of the National Socialist period. And in some ways, this was a very belated working through of that. As I think you could see. Today, it's a much more, at least it's a much more international group. It is still, I think, dominated by men. Unfortunately, though, there have been important voices of women as well, not just Susan Neiman, but people like Miriam Brusius, Zoe Samudzi. I think of Jennifer Evans, who organized the really important roundtable about the Catechism debate and Dirk Moses's essay. But it's still pretty much been dominated by men, a lot of the debate. But in terms of the question, and I think, so to get back to implication, the 80s debate was, in the 80s debate, you had a side that was really very clearly trying to relativize German responsibility for the Holocaust, the Nolte side. It's very clear that that's what's going on. The debate today is not about that at all, right? None of us are trying to take away German responsibility. It's really about an expansion of responsibility. So that we're talking not just about the Holocaust, but also about colonialism, also about racism today, contemporary racism, and the occupation of Palestine and other issues that come up in the debates as well. And so what we're really talking about is an expansion of responsibility, but I don't think that expansion of responsibility can take place under the sign of the perpetrator. Right. So there's certainly perpetration, but most of us who are interested in these debates and taking part of these debates and who are members of German society or international society or other national context are not themselves perpetrators, but they may very well be implicated subjects in my terms, right? They're indirect participants in histories of injustice and violence. And that's why I think this subject position of the implicated subject is maybe an important one to enter in here, because you see that the question isn't perpetrators or not, it's how do we talk about broader social responsibility for histories of violence and for structures of inequality. That's what I think is at stake in a lot of the debates today, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the debates about colonial legacies, roads must fall, all of this stuff. It's not about us acknowledging that we're perpetrators, it's acknowledging that we are implicated as, right, implicated subjects, and that our societies are places that produce various forms of complicity and implication. And that's what we're trying to confront, it seems to me.
Michael, listening to you suddenly made me realize like this interesting mirroring. You are saying we are trying to expand the responsibility to also other crimes. So what the other side is doing, no, we are not going to expand it. Holocaust is the crime. Anti-Semitism is the crime. but we are, but what they are trying to expand is the people who are responsible for being anti-Semitic, who are responsible for this crime. So, okay, maybe Hitler was bad, but how about the Mufti? He was also as bad. Or who, how about these Arabs, right? So so it is like some interesting mirroring of expansion for different purposes.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation and point. And I have to think about that more. I think, I wouldn't say strictly speaking, because I do think progress has been made. I mean, one of the questions we probably want to ask is like, where do we see this going? And, are there positive developments? Is it all negative? I don't, it's a complicated picture. But I think it's no longer the case that people are simply denying responsibility for, say, the Herero and Nama genocide, right, or German colonialism more broadly. I don't think you can do that anymore, and I think that's an accomplishment that activists in the Black German movement and the decolonial movements have. This is a real accomplishment. I think we have to recognize that. I don't think they can say that anymore. But what I've noticed is what I would call a kind of fetishism, which is in terms of the attitude toward these things. I know very well, but nevertheless, right? We know that there was colonialism. We can't deny that there was colonialism, but it's not the same as the Holocaust, right? And so the Holocaust then becomes a different kind of so that, in the piece that I wrote with Jürgen Zimmerer, we didn't give it the title, but the site gave it the title, take the taboo away from comparison or something like that. And the response was from the other side, if you will, was like, there's no taboo on comparison. Of course you can compare the Holocaust. And at first I was like, really? That's not my impression at all. But then I realized it's a twist in the argument. Yes, you can compare the Holocaust, but every time you do it, the answer is the same, which is that nothing else is like the Holocaust. And I think it's similar with the question of responsibility. No one serious, I think, can really deny responsibility for these other crimes. But there's a kind of relativization that takes place in the acknowledgement. I know very well, but it's not the Holocaust, right? It's not the same thing. You can't talk about them together. So there are these interesting shifts in the discourse that I've only really started to notice since being like at the middle of some of these controversies.
I mean, it seems like even though there's now recognition for the colonial memory, whether or not one can, without thinking about, which is worse, without trying to answer that kind of question, it seems that there's still an appeal to the state, right, which then makes the state's importance, it reifies the state's importance. So the state can decide, or these state institutions can decide whether or not, the coloniality is important. But then, our Arab claims, German Arab claims to participate, are those as important? It seems that the state is left at the center, and liberalism, and this kind of progressive version of liberalism, is also left standing, or reinforced even.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
So then, which leads me to a question about future directions. I mean, so is implication the next step politically, or like what is the next step politically? Or what do you think?
I don't know.
I feel like we're lucky if we are able to follow it 3 steps behind, right? It is going so fast that I feel proud of myself if I'm only 3 steps behind. So we do not know where it will go. But I also, still believe in the power of the story of the Holocaust. It can be, the right wing may be trying to appropriate it and brand it as white on white crime. So in that it is, different from all other crimes and it should have a different place, whatnot. But, anyone who pays attention to it, sees so much about how power works, how it is about majority-minority relationships. So I believe in the power of the story to keep its important as a leading narrative for left-wing struggle.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I do too, right? I teach the Holocaust every year. I've dedicated basically my entire professional life to thinking and writing about it and teaching it. And the teaching is really important. And the teaching is different, I think, also from from what we do in our research and what we do as public intellectuals, it has its own demands. And, I don't talk about the Holocaust necessarily the same way in all these different forums, not in contradictory ways, I think, but of course, right, you aim toward particular audiences. I mean, it's interesting, for the last few years, I've been involved in this, what we call here at UCLA, a cluster course, which is a team-taught interdisciplinary course that we've been doing on political violence in the modern world. And each year we pick 3 different case studies and focus on them over the course of the year. And I've been doing the Holocaust segment of this, and we've juxtaposed that over the years with the Armenian genocide, with the Rwandan genocide, with the massacres in Indonesia in the 1965 anti-communist massacres, and this year also talking about French colonialism. I say this only because in Germany, this seems like it would be completely verboten, right? This would be considered some sort of like impossible and anti-Semitic political project, but really it's just a pedagogical project, and it's incredibly interesting and rich to juxtapose these different cases, and they don't all come out looking the same, right? And they all have their different power, I suppose, to use that, that word that Esra was using, and they resonate together, but not in a way that collapses their differences. And that's really that is in fact my vision for multidirectionality. And it's been frustrating to see how difficult it is to get that across to at least some people in Germany. Well, I think there's also a welcoming, there's a welcome culture as well. And there are a lot of people who are looking for an alternative framework. And that makes me a little bit more optimistic. So I guess in terms of the outlook, that was a bit of a tangent there about UCLA, but I guess I'm of 2 minds. I think on the one hand, in this debate, you see people really digging in. In some ways, there has been great polarization, and as we've said, aggressiveness and hostility. And one of the things that surprised me is the way that what seemed like a very marginal, and I have to say kind of crazy anti-Deutsch ideology that I first encountered maybe 15 years ago in Germany has kind of moved to the center in a lot of ways. It's represented by a lot of very vocal, visible, and powerful journalists and others and other figures. And that has kind of surprised me, and that's a problem, I think, right? That's the dark side, if you will, this kind of digging in and the permeation of that particular ideology into the mainstream. But on the other side, I also have a certain kind of optimism, and I think it's similar to Esra's, that this story itself is powerful, but also that there's a lot happening on the ground, right? That these grassroots movements, anti-racist movements, decolonial movements are really starting to have an impact. That street names are being changed, right? That restitution, not just in Germany, but around the world, is starting to happen. And obviously there's still a long way to go, and we don't know who's going to follow through on these things. But again, I do feel like we're at a kind of a tipping point. And that I think it's maybe because we're at a kind of tipping point that the reactions are so hostile, right? And that they're so aggressive, and that people are digging in so much because they realize that the world is shifting and that the narrative can't stay the same. And so this attempt to hold on to that narrative is a bit desperate. It doesn't mean they're going to lose, right? I mean, we see this in the political arena more broadly. I mean, I'm deeply concerned about where we're going politically in the US. And in other places, but I also I do feel like there are reasons for optimism as well. And I just to finish this riff, go back to the Habermas and the Steinmeier. It's like an interesting moment where some of these debates have actually permeated all the way, have sort of penetrated all the way to the really most central, visible parts of German culture, and an adjustment has been made, right? Where there's been a recognition that no, we're not going to give up the uniqueness of the Holocaust, nor should we, right? But that we can also start to think about other things alongside that a certain kind of multidirectional vision could start to become more broadly shared and maybe more widely acceptable. And to me, that would be a positive thing, even if it does not solve all the problems by any means. And reactionary tendencies are there as well.
Thank you. So I guess we can turn to the questions now, start to turn. So one person's asking, what is the tipping point? Also, I'm not sure actually that I understand this question. Did you have anything to add to that, Esra, in terms of directions?
The two sides of the tipping point?
Do you see the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the second one.
Yeah, so please add your questions. If you want to clarify this question, I'm happy to or maybe Michael.
I mean, I think I think what they're saying, and I guess in some ways, I think I agree if I understand it, is that, yeah, we're at a tipping point, but things could still go in two very different ways, right? I mean, that I am scared about a sharp rightward turn in general, and that there could be a real digging in. And I mean, we do see this up to the moment with the way that someone like Naimi al-Hassan was treated, right? I mean, so there's a lot of evidence of, the power of the catechism, as Dirk Moses would say, still being very much in effect. So I think we have to take that seriously, and I suppose it could get even worse. But so I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I do think I guess maybe the point is we're at an important turning point, and it's going to be a matter of struggle, which way it goes. And again, I don't think that's just or primarily about Holocaust memory at all. I think that's a larger political question. And I don't think it's just about Germany. I think it's also a transnational, if not global, question of where things are going, that we really are in a very clear, very dire moment of crisis. Just, think climate, if nothing else. And where's it going to go? And is there really a will for a fundamental change? Obviously, I don't know. I guess I like to try to preserve some sense of optimism and to try to find sources for it. And again, I see them in some of these grassroots movements on the one hand, and in also some of the shifts that you see at the higher levels of discourse too. That's why I mentioned Steinmeier again. I thought that was an interesting speech, not perfect. Whether he follows through on any of it is obviously, an open question. But talking about this is a country with migration background. So there were some resonant and important phrases there that I thought were significant.
Okay, Sophie Schmallenberger has a question about, from how I've been observing the debate, Michael's book has been heavily criticized, not only from the German conservative right center, but also from actors who would describe themselves as part of a progressive left. Was this your impression as well? Or if so, what are your thoughts about this?
I mean, so I guess that must be for me, but yeah, no, I think that there's an interesting consensus that cuts across what we would have thought of as quite distinct political positions. And that has to do, I think, with this anti-Deutsch, this sort of generalization of a certain anti-Deutsch ideology, which proposes itself to be left, but isn't, as far as I can really understand it, very much. And so, yeah, it was the Taz as well as the FAZ, which very harshly criticized my work, and some of the other leftist publications as well. And so, yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I see as a peculiarity of the German context, right? I don't think you would see that in the US or Britain or France or other places, as far as I know. But there is a kind of consensus that cuts across society, which we used to think was a good thing. Again, right? It was initially, in the post-Historikerstreit moment, there was a kind of progressive consensus about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, the singularity of the Holocaust, and the importance of taking responsibility for it. And I do think that was a progressive gain, right? As opposed to the Noltes and Hillgruber and all these people, right? That was an important moment. And that was an accomplishment that Habermas and others made possible. But it always had its limits built into it. And I think those have started to show themselves more fully in the present. And so I suppose there are different lefts or different groups that are claiming the mantle of the left. And I think the left that we all would see ourselves as part of would see anti-racism, right, and some sort of decolonial or anti-colonial moment as essential components of what it means to be left. And what I see among some of these leftists in Germany is that that's not the case. We can't assume that that's true, that those things are fundamental. And, we're seeing this is not the same debate at all, but I think some of the vitriol about trans, phobia and this sort of things, and TERFs and et cetera, there are some strange configurations today where the left, I don't think we've surpassed the left-right divide, but I think it has been reconfigured, and we have to take that into account for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is also, I think throughout Europe and also in other places too, this kind of nationalist left, anti-immigrant left is pretty strong. That is how in Denmark, Social Democrats won. There is, strong trends like that in the Labour Party. So I guess, what we mean by left is one that believes in a plural society, not the kind of nationalist left, which is also pretty dominant. So if I can comment on Ben Ratzkoff's question, which is great, he says, what is the dark sides of unsavory forms of multidirectional memory and the Holocaust? I'm thinking of anti-vax protesters and Querdenken. Sorry, Michael, I'm jumping in even though the multidirectional memory is mentioned. But I think this kind of view that Germans are the victims of the Holocaust has been around since the very early days of the post-war. I think we are seeing, with RAF, for example, right? They had the idea that they are the victims. They even had the idea that, right, in Israel or a lot of Jews are actually the ones that are close to Nazis, and that is, how they explained a lot of their behavior. But in a way, I think it is not multi-directional, because I don't think there is really suffering of, out of vaccination, but this using the Holocaust imagery and turning Germans into the victims of it, I feel like has been a continuous story and fascinating one. I don't know if Michael has.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said, and I do think it's an important question. Thanks, Ben, for that. And I don't propose multi-directional memory as like a magic bullet that's going to solve all our problems. And I think it is very clear that there are unsavory forms of it, indeed, and we see that in the U.S. as well as in Germany and really all over. And I think that's not new, right? That's not new at all. That's an old phenomena. And maybe one that I didn't in the book itself treat as fully as I could have, because I was trying to make a different kind of argument. But I certainly would acknowledge it now. And I think, as many of you know, I've tried to put forward a framework that allows us at least to make some kind of distinctions between different forms of multidirectionality, and ones that in fact push toward what I call a kind of differentiated solidarity, and those that are really being mobilized for competitive reasons, for an embrace of a kind of victimization, as Esra was just saying, as a way of kind of, as a form of violence itself. I mean, I think that is possible for sure. And you see it in some of these far right appropriations. So yeah, I mean, I think it's true. So it's not a panacea by any means. There's a lot that still needs to be worked out, of course.
I just wanted to return. I mean, I want to go back to the questions, but I wanted to return back to something you were saying about political reorientation or a reconfiguration of how we understand left and right. Because it seems to me that the kind of moral debates that are happening around Holocaust memory and how people are positioned in relationship to them also maps onto other moral kinds of debates, which like around free speech even, in which, it's hard to distinct, like people on the left and the right are taking the same position, but it does seem to tie into kind of a politics around, a normative understanding of liberalism, but then also who can assert the need for an invocation, which is tied to, I think, like debates around white supremacy, but I don't know what you all think about that, but it seems to me that understanding the political map is really important to understand what to do next. I mean, understanding how people are configuring themselves in relationship to these debates is important. But let's return to the questions here. Ellie McQuaig is asking, does the study of Holocaust memory from specific perspectives of the GDR remain a viable area of research and study even 30 years after the fall of the wall? Off the top of your heads, are there any questions within that realm that we need to be trying to answer? Any issues that could be reached more extensively?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is outside my expertise, I have to admit. And I probably need to mark that even more fully when I do talk about these issues, that what I know best and what I tend to talk about is indeed a West German, and then Federal Republic in any case, history of memory. Again, I think that's an important, and I guess it's been controversial aspect of Niemann's book, Learning from the Germans, has been that she's in fact suggesting that we do go back to the GDR memory regime and that there is something to salvage from it. And I actually found myself kind of convinced by that chapter, though I know a lot of people are not, or that in any case it's been controversial. And, one of the points she's making is, or one of the things she's trying to recover there is a kind of anti-fascism, in which anti-Semitism was connected to or thought of as a species of racism. And I think, probably one would have to say that in the GDR itself, this was a way of minimizing Jewish specificity and the specificity of the Holocaust, or at least that's the traditional argument. But I think there's still something to salvage from that. And I think that's what a lot of us are in fact committed to, is a vision in which we are able to think about anti-Semitism relationally and in relation to other forms of racism. And that's one of the things that is, I would say, taboo, though people will say there is no taboo, right? That is taboo in Germany, right? And this is very particular to Germany. And, that's one of the things that's, I think, for me, has emerged in these debates, and Jürgen Zimmer and I made this point in our piece. There's a real provincialism to the German discourse, right? And one of the aspects of that provincialism is this insistence and almost disbelief, right, that anti-Semitism might be a form of racism. If that's something that can be salvaged from this alternative tradition within Germany, I think that's an interesting project, but not one that I know enough myself to really do.
I can jump in. I'm also not so, that's also my weak spot, as I did my research, Muslims in relation to Holocaust memory, which is mainly in West Germany. But one of the migrant-initiated Holocaust education projects that moved me a lot was initiated by a Turkish workers' union. And their understanding of the need to fight or to commemorate the Holocaust was definitely this East German interpretation of Holocaust as fascism, as a tool of capitalism, whatnot. I was really struck by how in that narrative they found a comfortable place for themselves to remember the Holocaust and to fight against it, that it never happens again. The never again wasn't the same as the never again in West Germany, but they, this workers' union, these factory workers, regularly meet to talk about the Holocaust and, out of their pocket visit concentration camps. I was like, wow, this is amazing.
And I would link that to, just as you were talking, it reminded me of what to me is also a very moving and inspiring project, which is the project now in in a new phase, I guess, of the collaboration between Esther Bejarano and Esther Bejarano's family and the rap group Microphone Mafia, which takes place also under the banner of anti-fascism, really. I mean, those are the political commitments. And, I think there are limits to the anti-fascist vision. There are certain simplifications that take place, but it's also very enabling and very powerful. And to me, to see a collaboration between a 80 and then 90-something-year-old Jewish Holocaust survivor and some migrant hip hop, artists and activists and social workers as they are, That's very powerful, and it remains very powerful, because I think even though Esther passed away this year, she was really doing it up until the very end. And I think Microphone Mafia and Kutlu Yurtseven, the project continues in a certain sense. And so I think there are those sorts of, I think there are those kind of alternative examples that are important to recapture, and that I think are incredibly inspiring and moving.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's important, yes, to think about the East German archive, but then also to think about what happens when one finds racism in the archive and how that works in relationship to the anti-fascist project. I mean, I was just in a panel today, somebody doing research in Bulgaria, and she was talking about the Roma in Bulgaria and socialist Bulgaria, and the kind of the racist rhetoric that was used, and then how do we think these things together? I mean, would be a question, but clearly an important work to be done.
Yeah, I'm not endorsing like the full-scale reclamation of an East German anti-fascism. I simply don't know enough, and I'm sure that there are those kinds of problems. But again, as a kind of alternative, as an alternative archive with its contradictions, as you say, I mean, I think that's to be able to think it through with the contradictions, but also the possibilities, seems to me an important project. And again, something that in the public debate, at least, around these issues has been missing is the ability to offer nuanced perspectives that can both acknowledge shortcomings and limitations and still also find some value, right? Or find some alternative visions. That's my main accusation about what's happened to German memory culture, Holocaust memory culture, is it's become so incredibly dogmatic. It's become so dogmatic that you can't actually have a reasoned, rational exchange about some of these issues, at least in certain quarters. And that seems to me a real law. And there's just an assumption that you are an agent of some nefarious force. So, and, nefarious anti-Semitic force. And, it's crazy to me, but it's that dogmatism, which I do think set in sometime. I don't know how you guys would date it. I first started to notice it, let's say around 2008. And I happened to be spending a year in Berlin at that time. And I was like, wow, something has changed. Something is going on here that is different from what I expected. And this model that I have always held up, right, as a model of how you come to terms with the past that you are implicated in, something is going wrong. And that was already clear to me in 2008, but I think it's really been amplified and accelerated since then. And it is this kind of dogmatism that you find that I find really troubling.
Yes. Okay. So Sultan Doğan has a question. I wanted to ask both panelists and also Damani about implication with regards to citizenship in all of this. Mm-hmm. How would you describe, or how do you conceptualize citizenship when it is based on implication? If we assume differential implications with regard to the Holocaust, can political agency be forged beyond responsibility, guilt, victimhood? How does implication allow for moral plurality? I'm also asking because Afro-Germans or descendants of Black Germans are not just implicated, but also sometimes part of the Holocaust victim position. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sultan's work on citizenship is, I'm hoping going to help answer all of these questions. Because I know she has a lot to say about this, and it's something that I'm still working through myself. I mean, it's a central category for me, but I'm still trying to figure it out and understand it. I mean, in terms of what you just said about the last part of the question about Black Germans, I absolutely agree. And for me, one of the most important categories from that last book that I wrote is, in fact, the notion of complex implication, which is a way of acknowledging that we are complexly situated in relationship to multiple histories, by which I mean precisely that we can occupy positions with lines of connection both to histories of perpetration and to histories of victimization. And for me, again, I'll do it again autobiographically, right? As a Jewish American, right? You certainly inherit, even though my family, at least my immediate family, was not in the Holocaust. They had left Europe in the decades before that. But you certainly inherit a long history of anti-Semitism and victimization, and anti-Semitism continues up to the present. That is real, right? So there's a history of suffering there. But at the same time, as a Jew and as an American, I find myself implicated in very unsavory histories of violence that are unfolding in the present, as well as ones that unfolded in the past and whose effects continue today. And so I feel, in a sense, complexly implicated, right? And I think that can be it can be a powerful inspiration for activism. I think it can probably lead to forms of resentment and this sort of thing too. And that's another thing I'm trying to think more about, the relationship between affect and implication and solidarity. But for me, at least, I feel like it's taking something from that history of victimization and allowing it to, for me, it inspires forms of solidarity, I guess, and acknowledgement of the ways that I'm implicated as a taxpayer in the United States, as someone who was interpolated by the state of Israel as Jewish, and therefore, this state is somehow mine. All of these things, I think we can acknowledge the complexity of our locations and act from that complexity. That doesn't quite answer the question about citizenship, but I don't want to go on any more right now.
And did you want to respond to that, Esra? Or should I go to the next question?
As I was listening, I was thinking about also how time plays into this. Obviously the effects of a crime continues for hundreds of years, right? Think about slavery, right? We have very, very real effects of it. All this wealth that has been accumulated, all, forms of dehumanization that continues to today are a very real result of that. But in relation to the Holocaust, maybe because it has been commemorated, because it has been conceptualized as a lot of it, we see a lot of discussions of it in relation to morality, or this individualized, was grandpa a Nazi or not a Nazi? So those kinds of things, or, teachers asking students, go find out what, your grandfather was doing during the war. So those things have to change, right? Because, people in countries like Germany, maybe it is different in other places where people know, their family 17 generations back. But in Germany, if they have not, no one will care as much about the grandfather's grandfather. So the way it is commemorated, the way it is remembered will change. Something about it will change, So I think this tension around Holocaust memory partly is about that, as the last perpetrators are dying, then how are we going to, this listening to the witnesses is a huge part of Holocaust remembrance in Germany. So where there are no witnesses anymore, what is going to happen to that ritual? How are people going to be transformed? So yeah, I was just thinking about the reality of a lifespan.
I think that's also a really profound point and an important point. I think we have to acknowledge that things have to change, right? Things have to change for exactly those reasons. We're at a moment of generational transition. And I guess I've always thought, the argument I've always made is that then the immigrant figure becomes an interesting figure at that point, because in some sense, we're all going to be located in that kind of indirect relationship to the events that the migrant who migrates into the history, right, as Shenojek famously said, does. And so I feel it, I've always found it powerful to think from the perspective of the migrant, precisely because that kind of organic, close temporality that has defined a lot of the discussions about Holocaust memory so far is inevitably not going to be there, right? Things are changing. And so we need other positions from which to think. So again, I think that's a really valuable point. I think at the same time, like, there clearly still sort of holes in that generational memory. Like there was earlier this year, another of the controversies, right now it seems like another decade ago, was around Menschen mit Nazi Hintergrund, right? People with a Nazi background. And this intervention by two children of refugees, as they called themselves, sort of calling Germans to account for the material benefits that they may have accrued by virtue of a familial connection or social society, larger societal connection to the Nazi period. And that was a controversial moment as well. I thought for me, it was, again, an interesting thing to think with and to think about. How do we think about implication, and how do we think about, because I had not thought very much about material beneficiaries of the Holocaust. To me, that's always seemed very secondary, but that intervention made me think a little bit more. Like, how, in fact, is the materiality of post-war Germany also shaped by the dispossession of Jews, during the Nazi period, and how does that live on to this day? Again, I think of it by analogy to the slavery question that Esra just mentioned, and this project in Britain, the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project that Catherine Hall and others have done. We're trying to trace some of those material continuities. So yeah, I think that's a really a productive way to think about it.
Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. There are many more questions, so I think we can copy those and you can have them. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Michael and Esra. Thank you, Janet and Ben Folger, for helping us to organize this. So there's obviously more to say and more to do in regards to these debates and memory culture and possibility, I think, for the people who are not only implicated but affected by the violence and the memory. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.